Welcome, everyone. We are very glad that you are here with us for this webinar. We are going to be studying the new NAEYC position statement on developmentally appropriate practice, and we'll be taking you through some ideas and some considerations to think about developmentally appropriate practice as deep, something deeper than just what we've always been doing, and something new that we can consider to make a better early childhood for our children and our families first and foremost, but also for us as teachers and for our community. We want to take a moment just to acknowledge that this is a collaborative session between the Arizona Association for the Education of Young Children and the Southern Arizona Association for the Education of Young Children. Both of us are sister affiliates of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, NAEYC, and we both do the work of supporting NAEYC members and early childhood educators across the state of Arizona. My name is Dr. Eric Boucher. I'm the Chief Executive of AzAEYC. We serve educators and support early childhood professionals in Maricopa County, Yuma County, Pinal Gila, and everything north in the state. And I'd love for my colleague Kelly to introduce herself.
Hi, good evening, everyone. This is Kelly Larkin. It's good to be here. I am the Executive Director of Southern Arizona, and we cover the 5 southern counties. And it's just great to see everyone here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So we want to take a moment to think about what could be. So we invite you to just take a moment to, if you want to, you can close your eyes and just imagine an early childhood that could be. What's pretty apparent is that we cannot go back to the early childhood systems that we've had before the pandemic. They were inaccessible, they were inequitable, and we need to think about some new early childhood opportunities for children, for families, and for educators. So just take a moment to imagine. Imagine an early childhood where children and educators engaged in joyous learning, where we thought about children and teachers as capable and competent learners, where early childhood was equitable, and early childhood was considered a public good, where we had state and federal investments because it's the right thing to do for children and families. Imagine an early childhood where teachers are paid a worthy wage that's reflective of their complex and important work, taking care of young children, helping provide rich and culturally and linguistically responsive experiences, and building their brains so that they are successful not only as learners in school, but as lifelong learners. What we want to invite you to do tonight is really think about a new early childhood, not one that's existed before. We can't go to the childhood that we've provided in the past. That early childhood was inequitable. Our goal and our hope is for sessions like this, where we use the developmentally appropriate practice position statement, the advancing equity statement from NAEYC, and some of our work that really drives a new narrative for early childhood, like some of the work that's being done in Reggio Emilia in Italy, in New Zealand, and other countries around the world, to really think about not what has been and what we've always done, but really what could be possible for children, families, educators, and our communities. It's my pleasure to turn it over to my good colleague and friend, Mona Kafisha, and she will introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to see everybody here. So I have the privilege of introducing Nicole. Nicol Russell currently serves as the Director of Head Start Research and Support for Teaching Strategies. Previously, she served as the Deputy Associate Superintendent for Early Childhood at the Arizona Department of Education and the Director of the Arizona Head Start State Collaboration Office. In those roles, she provided oversight for Arizona's administration of the Preschool Development Grant, implementation of IDEA Part B, Section 619, which is Early Childhood Special Education, and execution of the Head Start State Collaboration Office grant. The activities of each of these grants created opportunities for children in Arizona's mixed delivery system for early childhood education. Nicole holds a bachelor's degree in early childhood education and a master's degree in early childhood education with an emphasis in early childhood leadership from Northern Arizona University. Go Jacks. She's also a doctoral candidate focusing her research on the effects of schooling on Indigenous students and educators. In addition to championing high quality early learning for all children in all settings. Nicole enjoys time with her family and considers being a mom to her 5-year-old, McKenna Ukulea, as her greatest role. Nicole began her career in education as a librarian's assistant at her local Boys and Girls Club in Waimea, Hawaii. Since then, she's worked as a classroom assistant, teacher, general and special education, center director of a private childcare, education program specialist, and the state 619 coordinator. Nicole is currently serving a 4-year term as an at-large board member for the National Association for the Education of Young Children. She has also served as a treasurer for the National Association of Early Childhood Specialists in state departments of education. Nicole, we're so glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to see some familiar faces and new faces. I always consider being able to do local Arizona work such a treat because so much of what I do now is done at the national level and servicing partners all across the country. It's exciting when I get to see people I know and care about and have relationships with. So I'm really appreciative for you all hosting this session this evening, for us getting a chance to talk about something that I know we have a mutual appreciation and respect for, these position statements that come from NAEYC. I know we look for them because they provide guidance to our work. And I love that Eric started with a hopeful message, that this isn't about what we didn't do before, but this is about imagining a new way forward. And I'm excited to be part of this. I appreciate you as well, Mona, doing that introduction and giving people a little bit about who I am and what I've done. I think it's important that when you talk about a message this important, what's developmentally appropriate for children and how do you marry that with these ideas about equity and social and racial justice, that it's important you know where speakers are coming from. I'm here because I'm passionate about creating a world that's fair for people, that's just. I think empathy is most lacking now, but the thing we can easily do if we start from the beginning, right? That we start to teach children what it's like to consider perspectives other than our own, what it's like to live lives that aren't like ours. And it takes adults like you and I and all of us here just taking action, right? Do things differently. That's what disruption is, so that we can create the new early childhood, as Eric said, and change the way that we've done things in the past. And maybe there's some things we were doing that we want to keep doing because they were working. We were already looking at how to make things more equitable for children. So we don't want to let go of what was working, but definitely how do we do it differently moving forward in more ways for more children so that we have an amplified effect. I thought what we could do is sort of set the stage, right? What are we doing here? When we talk about moving from DAP to DEEP, what does that mean? And so when we look at DAP, right, we are all familiar with that. I don't care if you've never taken a college course, if you've never been anywhere, if you work in your childhood, you've at least heard this, right? People talking about developmentally appropriate practice, or DAP. I have the privilege of being on the National Governing Board, and I'm so excited to be there at this time. My term in July of 2019. And I was so excited to go there because folks were starting to work on revising this position statement. And this has influenced my entire career. You know, the last 23 years I've been working in this field and working in education, and this has always been there influencing me. And I thought, oh my gosh, here I get to show up where this is being done, and I can influence what becomes the new Bible of early learning, as people call it, for the future. And I was so excited that we were looking at it intentionally with the focus on how do we ensure that when we say developmentally appropriate, that we're not excluding folks' languages, their cultures, their family, what's important to families. How do we ensure appropriate is not centering whiteness or Eurocentric ideas, right? How do we bust that up from what it used to be? And I was on a session right when we did the release of the statement. And one of the folks that led us through the rewrite of the position statement was Barbara Weller, who, if you are familiar with NAEYC, she was key to the first writing of the position statement. She's been at NAEYC, she just retired, she's been there a long time. But she made this statement and it has stuck with me in all the days since. And I said, every time I talk about the new position statement, I'm going to talk about it in this way. She said if she could rename it, she'd rename it from DAP to DEEP, Developmentally Informed, Evidence-Based, Equitable Practice. And I thought in those 4 letters, she really succinctly captured what the spirit of the new position is. Right, that we are not only looking at what's developmentally right for children, but that we have evidence that what we're doing also creates more equitable experiences for them and their children. So when I was thinking about doing this session with you all, I thought this is what we're going to talk about. How is that? Why would someone say so boldly, this is what we're looking forward to, right? We did DAP in the past, and I say we did really, really well at coming to a common mutual understanding of developmentally informed, to the point that when people would ask us, what is DAP, we would say it depends, right, on what's developmentally right for that child. And then we start to get into evidence-based. We had some other initiatives that were happening in the education space that really turned our attention to what does it mean to be evidence-based. We had No Child Left Behind. We have ESSA. In the K-12 world, they're talking about what does it mean to be evidence-based. So we have a lot of that already happening. But what I feel we've been missing is this third part, right? How do we ensure that at each of these dimensions, we're also talking about what is equitable? What does that even mean? And so I thought for this session tonight, if we took this approach to our time together, we might be able to, at the end of this, answer that question. So I intend for this to be a discussion. we're going to have intentional breakout rooms because I want you to have time to discuss some of what we're going through. I don't want it to be just a lecture style where it's me showing you the statement and then talking about just my thoughts on it, but the dialogue is where true learning will happen. And also it gives us space to think out loud with one another and, as Eric said, to reimagine with one another. So the flow of the talk tonight we'll start with a review of the position statement. What's the purpose? What's its structure? We're going to focus on the 3 core considerations: context, commonality, and individuality, because those will be the guiding principles, right? And then we're going to have an open discussion of strategies to address equity, social and racial justice. And those things are important for us to define. They're important for us to see examples of how does this show up in the early learning setting, whether that's in a classroom, if it's in a home, if it's just in relationships that we have with children and their families, these things tether to them. So how do we address that? And as individuals, we'll do some self-reflection and then talk about collectively as early childhood professionals, what do we do about this? So it's an ambitious agenda, but I think we can do it. So let's get started. Developmentally appropriate practice. I'm going to take you to where this is located online. I love to do this with folks because I think when I attend sessions, it's great when people talk about it, but if they can show me where to go find it myself, that's helpful because after the fact, I can go and visit that over and over again anytime that I want to. So this is on the NAEYC website. I'm going to make this a little bit larger so you can see it better. The Developmentally Appropriate Practice Position Statement. It starts right here, right up front. What's the purpose of this? When we say this is a position statement, it means we're taking a position. And what is that? And it tells you right up front, each and every child birth through age 8 has the right to equitable learning opportunities in centers, family child care homes, or schools that fully support their optimal development and learning across all domains and content areas. I think that's a really bold statement to start with. And I'm glad that that is the one we chose to start talking to folks about our new focus on this right to equitable learning opportunities. I want to scroll over to this right side because this really is the structure of the document. You can download it in English or in Spanish, and each of these parts is there. I like this menu because it's an interactive menu. So if you wanted to go right to the definition, you could click on that and it pulls up the definition here. So rather than searching through the PDF, you have it right at your fingertips. When you come up to the position, that's what we read there, right? But what's the purpose of this? Why was there to revise the position statement? How does this relate to the other foundational pieces of NAEYC? That's laid for you here. So you don't have to memorize this, you just have to know where to come and find it. So I wanted to show that to you, that this statement is part of, is just one of 5 foundational positions that NAEYC has taken. Tonight, we're talking about developmentally appropriate practice, and we're going to talk about how this relates to advancing equity in early childhood education. But as this graphic demonstrates, these things are interconnected, they overlap, they're interdependent. You can't do one without the other. And so while we won't get into all of them, I wanted to just point out that we'll be talking about these 2 here. When you come back over here, the next thing under the definition are the core considerations. I mentioned that just before we got into this, that those things are commonality, context, and individuality. I'm going to skip over that for just a minute because we're going to get into some specific in-depth work around the core considerations, but I do want to review the rest of this with you. So there are principles of child development and learning, the guidelines, how do we create a community of learners, engage in, I went too quickly, relationship, observing and assessing children's development. I'm especially biased about this one because here's where I felt I was able to contribute the most to the new position statement, because I care passionately about ways that we value or demonstrate that we value what children know, and that children come to know about the world in the context of families and communities. And so when we consider assessing what it is they know, in my mind, you can't do that without considering how did they come to know that. And so this section here, I go to often document folks in my particular role as a researcher at one of the most used curriculum and assessment companies is, I want to live this. And so I bring this part to my work daily. Teaching to enhance development and learning. This may be where, as a teacher, if you're a classroom teacher or a caregiver that's in settings with young children, you might spend a lot of time looking at what does this mean. You might do both of these in tandem with one another. And then it just keeps going down, right? Planning the curriculum, demonstrating professionalism, recommendations for implementing. And then there's a bunch of other recommendations and the rest of the document. So that's just the high level overview of what the position statement is, how it's laid out, and how you can access that on the website. Now I want back to, I'm going to go back to my, oh my goodness, lost my train of thought. I'm going to go back to the presentation because I want to talk about those 3 core considerations: commonality, context, individuality. So let's start that first about commonality. It's pretty simple, right? Things that we have in common, but it's not just what we have in common. This is actually specific thinking about what's commonly known about children's development and what's known about the practices that when you're responding to how children learn. In my mind, this really is about understanding teaching and learning relationship. That happens, there's a give and take, a back and forth. Those things happen at the same time. right? As you're teaching children learning, and as they're learning, they're teaching you and you're learning, and that happens in a back and forth. When you think about context, that expands a little more on commonality. Because when you think about context, now you're talking about the things that are personal and individualized to a person, but they've learned that in the context of their families, their communities, their primary caregivers prior to coming to you, right? That's their traditions, their values, their customs, their dress, their language, all those things help create the context in which they're coming to learn about the world. And then you think about how that intersects with the communities that they live in. So those are the social effects, racial effects, the economic situation, the political environment. Where those things intersect also create the context in which these children are living. And I will point out here that even though I keep talking about children and their family, there's this parallel thing that happens, right? Because this is also about you. It's about the context you came to know about the world. It's the context of how you developed over time and come to know what you know about living and life and all of that, and you bring that to the relationship that you form with children. Now, this last one, individuality, is about how we consider that, right? Okay, so we know there are certain about all children and about all learning and all that. There's just things we know. We do understand that there's a context in which people learn about the world. Now we get down to what does that mean for them as an individual? And are we respectful of those things, right? That there are experiences and characteristics unique to each child, that within their own family and in their own community, there are things unique to them. And how do we respond to that? These three core considerations, I think, really are the link to opening up the door for us talking about what does it mean to create equitable experiences for children. It's part of why we couldn't have this discussion about moving from DAP to DEEP without also talking about equity. And to get there, we have to come to a mutual understanding of what that is. Now, I want to give you an example, and I put this disclaimer here. I didn't want to say warning because it's not a warning, more like a for your information. I'm going to show an image. It's of what happened last week at the US Capitol, because I thought this was such a great way to demonstrate when those things all come into play: commonality, context, and individuality. If it's too much for you to look at or you don't want to hear us talking about it, please, feel free. You can turn the volume down, you can turn your camera off, whatever it is you need to do to protect your well-being. I want us to be able to have a conversation about this. So give us just a second. Folks can do as they please while I get this up. So here's the image that I want you to consider. Last week on January 6th, our lives really, and I'm not trying to be overly dramatic here, but it changed, right? Something on that day that at the foundation of our democracy, when you think about that, there was a shift, there was something that happened, and it created this earthquake of effects in our communities. And I've been hearing I've been talking with colleagues, I've gotten in the field and emails, talk the appropriateness of discussing events. Now, I had some folks who were approaching me and saying, to talk about this, such pushback, can you help me make a case for why we talk about this with children? And then I had others who said, I really think this is right to talk about with children. How can I make that case for, I was hearing all of this. And I thought, given what I know about developmentally appropriate practice, those considerations about what's common, right? All context is happening in, and individual effects that this would have on children and the effect it was having on educators, I thought this would be a really great way for us to have a dialogue in a breakout group. So I am going to ask you that when you get sent to a breakout, which we're going to do here in just a minute, that you consider that image. And I want you to talk about, what you felt about that event. You can talk about your reaction to that photo if you'd like. I'm going to put it back up once we get into breakout rooms. What the day after was like if you had to return to a classroom or if you had children with you, how it might have impacted the way you're thinking about your teaching. I mean, I just want to know or want you to have a conversation about your reactions to that and how it affected what you're doing with children. And we're going to give you some time, about 15 minutes, to have this dialogue in your breakout room. And what we'd like you to do, the only ask is that when you come back to the larger group, that someone or a few of you, if you'd like to, is prepared to just share what the dialogue was like. What are some of the things you considered? Were there things that you had to wrestle over, or was everyone sort of on the same page? Because I think that'll really add to our discussion that we're having. Is there a group that would like to share out first, or is anyone prepared already to share what their discussion was like?
Our group can. Wendy's our sharer from our group, so
I saw her hand
Thank
up.
you, Wendy.
Okay.
Well, and I'm just gonna bet that we have a lot of crossover similarities. So, yeah, what was interesting in our group was where there was only one of us that is working with children currently, because we all have different demographic of where we are professionally. So we were kind of relying on that report to inform us. And then I want to thank you for hosting that as well. So how can parents best work in the home with their child, and we can work as a team in the classroom as well? Again, taking the lead from the kids, being respectful of children and their family's opinions, and just creating safety and a place of love. That was another helping parents deal with fears. Understand where the family is coming from, and that this experience is not about tearing us apart. It's about creating unity.
I appreciate you sharing that from those multiple perspectives. Kelly, I know you had your hand up. Did you want to share your discussion?
Sure. So the breakout group that I was in, most of us are in like an administrative role, so we don't work directly with children. And then we do have a university student here tonight, so she is actually not in the classroom as well. And so we just kind of, I think one of the things, like I think Wendy just said, this idea of how do teachers and children have conversations to make them feel secure and safe. There was some conversation that we could imagine that in some schools or some adults, teachers might feel uncomfortable having the conversation with children based on what they know about their communities and possibly parents' political views. And then I think just one of the things that we really came away with is that when children are asking questions, they're looking for a sense of like safety and security. And so how do we help guide those conversations in class when we have them? And likewise, I think as adults and teachers, we look for the same thing in the environments that we teach in. And if anyone from my group wants to jump in and say something else, please feel free.
Thank you for sharing your group's experience and your dialogue. I'm going to take a different turn here. Did any of you in your conversations with your groups talk about the effects it may have had on the teachers? Did that come up for me? Jenny, I see your hand up. Would you mind sharing what that conversation was like?
Not at all. We kind of went briefly just, through introductions. There were 2 directors and 4 teachers that work with younger children, 2 and 3-year-olds, I believe. I think there might have been someone that also worked with 4-year-olds. And when we talked about the events, kind of the day after experiences, even the day of, people talked about more on a personal level, feeling unsettled, feeling very attached to the news, kind of feeling that pull of what's going on. And someone said she felt just tired and worn out from it all. Somebody said it was just awful. We had somebody in our group that's actually new to living in the United States, and she said, "I can't believe this is happening in the United States," which I thought was a really powerful statement. Most of the people in my group said at work it didn't really come up with their coworkers. In my experience, it did come up with my coworkers. I'm a director, and I had teachers reach out to me just kind of anticipating, how are we going to handle this if it's brought up at school? And so we sent out a letter. I sent a letter out that night, just with kind of talking points, sort of piggybacking on what Kelly was saying about how we talk to kids about difficult events. It was a similar letter that I used with school shootings and other events that have happened over the past 10 years. Yeah, that's kind of the direction our group was going in. And I don't know if you want me to share the rest of kind of how it impacted the work. We also talked about that a little bit.
Oh, you could go ahead and share it. That would be good.
Okay. Folks said that this is really, that teaching young children is really a way that we can change these kinds of things that we were seeing. And ways that we're doing that is, peace building skills, teaching stress management. Someone brought up conscious discipline, conflict resolution, teaching tolerance, how to be a community member, and how to work together are all ways that we're working towards, these kinds of more peaceful solutions.
I appreciate you sharing that and how you guys went right to the strategy, right? How do we teach this so we can change that reality? Sherilyn, I know you had your hand up before. Is there something you wanted to add here?
Yeah, I just wanted to add in regard to how our colleagues felt, amongst their own peers. It really impacted people to the point where they felt worried about their own safety at work. So, a few of us in our group mentioned that, the safety aspect became a point of discussion and making sure that, people got home from work okay. I mean, that's really, it's not surprising, but at the same time, it is because, this event that happened so far away manifested itself into our own communities here in Arizona, for us to feel physically, sick about, what happened. And then for us to have to check on each other that way, with the worry that something could happen like that, in our own communities. So that was one aspect that came up. So it was really felt at a deep level. And, our group also talked about how when you're talking about issues of racism, social justice, how deep do you go? Children are affected by stress just as much as we are as adults. And, the mirror neurons, how do we keep our kids safe and ourselves, in a safe emotional and mental state to have these conversations? There's that aspect of it too. And then another person had also pointed out, that the future, this left a big mark on the future of the kids. The children are going to have to grow up with this as a part of their history. So how do we begin, talking about it now? And not all of us are with our kids. A lot of people are working online and don't have that personal connection, physical personal connection with the children or with the families. But at some point, we're going to be back in the classroom in those contexts where, we're going to have to come together to talk about this at some point.
Right.
Thank you for sharing that part. Wendy?
Yeah, just briefly, and it just really pains me to even bring this up, but as administrators and staffs, we need to be problem solving about how to keep our centers safe over the next few weeks.
Yeah, that's a reality, right? Like you said, that
it is a reality.
Talk about, but also you recognize the circumstances we're living in has now put us in these positions of thinking through what the next week will be like and the week after that will be like. So you're spot on when you bring that up here. Did we hear from all the groups? Is there anyone else who wanted to share? I don't want to move on until, if someone has something to say.
Nicole, we could go. It's
Okay.
Camille. And I was in group 6. And so we had no one working with children either. So it was more of an administrative type of a viewpoint. But at some point, I think most of us did work with children. So school is a place where we help children. And perhaps you could just jump in, because I know you were talking about like kids. I think it was like kids having a voice, and, you know, not just teaching about things, but like giving them, you know, a voice to talk about if they're not in agreement with something. I want to make sure I got that part right, because it was at the very end and she got cut off midstream. But another part of our conversation too is not only talking about feelings, but talking about making choices. You know, good choices, bad choices. What kind of choices would you make? So that's what we talked about.
That's good, and I appreciate you bringing that up. It's interesting how many of you say you're removed from the classroom, but your thinking goes all the way back to that prior experience of, if I were in the classroom, right? Your preparation for having this conversation. If you're like me and you live in a house with young children, you probably were thinking about that too, right? How do I have this conversation? My husband is a political junkie and watches a lot of the news, and that's on all the time if he's around. And so my daughter, I know she saw that. She said, what are those people being mean about? You know, she just said that very casually, but for her, that's what that was about, was just mean people. But it, you know, so not acknowledging that children may have a response is not what we want to do. But to the point that you all are making, I love that the very first comment was, we follow their cues. And I think that really sets us up for understanding what it means to adequately respond, appropriately incorporate what's happening in the world around us. For children, it depends, right, on what their prior experience is like, what their family's experience is like. I was sharing with Eric while you all were in the breakout room that I had a really emotional response to this event, because this Sunday, January 17th, 1893, the U.S. military came in, they overthrew the queen, the last reigning queen of Hawaii. They held her prisoner in the palace, and the people, so my great-grandparents who came there to see her, were threatened with their lives, you know, being killed if they didn't return home. And there was an occupation that happened of the nation of Hawaii before annexation and statehood that my grandmother lived through, my mother lived through. And so this just felt super familiar to me. Like, I can't explain that. When people talk about historical generational trauma, I felt this in my bones. Like, I couldn't explain why it felt so personal. Like, this was happening again to me. And I thought, imagine all the children who are living there right now, my nieces, my nephews who are in Hawaii at this time, seeing this thing happen. What are the conversations happening in classrooms right now? Is anyone acknowledging that that's part of who they are? And so I just felt the next day, I was sad that people were moving on, like nothing happened. And I had to be in meetings and no one mentioned it. And I thought, how is this not the thing everyone's talking about? But I had to check myself and say, well, their experience isn't what your experience is. Their family life was nothing like yours. So I had to reposition myself to say, okay, this is what we're talking about. This is the hard work, right? Is acknowledging that the experience is different for all people. And so when we go all the way down to thinking about children in the classroom, we're mindful of what is right in front of them, but then we also create space for them having different feelings because of the context in which they're coming to know about life. So I do appreciate you all sharing your experiences with one another, being willing to talk about this in our group, because I think this is how we expand on our own thinking. And as we start to think about how difficult the work of moving to a more equitable and a more just society is, it's going to be important that we take the time to listen to the experiences of others and to hear their perspectives. And that's a really nice segue into us looking at the Advancing Equity in Early Childhood Education position statement. Like I said at the beginning, I couldn't see how we could talk about DAP without talking about this, because this is an essential component of determining what's appropriate for children that also helps create more equitable learning experiences for them. But before we get into the statement, I want us to come to a place where we have sort of a mutual understanding of what we're talking about when we say equity. What is equity? I'm going to share with you this resource because it's one of my favorites to use. And I'm going to take you right to it. And this will be one of the resources that we provide to you at the end of this. But one of my favorite ways of thinking about equity is to talk about it like this. This is a series of cartoons that were drawn up to help us bust out of the way we've always thought about equity. I know that when I was learning in my special education program about equity, this is how it was described to me, right? People say equality is everybody gets the same. Equity is everybody gets what they need. And I thought, oh, that's great. And for years, I talked about it like that. And in recent years, I've been challenged to think about this differently. And I thought the resource does a really great job of showing why we start to think about this differently. How can we, for some of you, if you're used to seeing that image like that, you might think, well, what's wrong with this? Well, the very first person says, we really aren't talking about this. We're not talking about a game, right? We're talking about lives of real people. This is not something that happens to others. You are in life for each child, for each person. They're not standing and watching. They're over here. They're in it. This is not a game that people can stand back and passively observe. This is out there everyday reality. I thought that was a really great way of looking at that. Another perspective was shared was thinking about privilege that occurs, and that privilege can be a tool for building, destroying. So when we think about equity, like how we use the privileges that we have. Many of us here have privilege in different ways, right? We have education that affords us privilege and access to institutions that those without degrees can have access to. We have work experiences that give us keys into other work experiences that folks may never have the opportunity to do. So it's just about repositioning how we think about what privilege it is that we do have. But I especially liked this description. Equity is a home, not like a physical house, but rather a home, because that's more metaphorical. It's a sense of belonging and And I thought really what we're getting to, I don't know about you, but I truly, each person deserves a home. They have a right to a home that's different than the right to a house, right? Because in homes, we know not all is well all the time for all people, but home where you feel like that's where I belong. These people acknowledge who I am. They accept who I am. They love who I am. That's what we're talking about when we get to equity. So I wanted to start with us defining equity that way, because I think that's important. The second thing I think we should define is, what is it when we say social justice? What are we talking about? I'm a reader. I love to read lots of things by folks who know much more about this than I do. And I'm always taking notes. You know, I'm a writer here. I was taking notes while you all were talking because it helps me embed that into my thinking. And so here are some that I like around social justice. The struggle for a more equitable distribution of social and economic goods, for greater personal and political dignity, and for a deeper moral vision of society. That's sort of a high level definition. The second one, moving towards a society where all hungry are fed, all sick are cared for, the environment is treasured, and we treat each other with love and compassion. This last one is the way that I think about it personally, that social justice says each and every person has value, and we work continuously to create that reality. And when I talk about person, because of my cultural background, when I think about person, person is connected to the earth and to the spirit world. And so I'm talking about as a whole, we value life, all things. And so defining social justice that way, I think helps us see that this isn't about who's supposed to get what. This is just that we value all folks have a right to all these things that we're talking about here. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. And then third, our shared definition of racial justice, right? There are two ways you can look at this: one as an outcome and two as a process. And actually, almost always it's both. As an outcome, it's when we get to a place where your race no longer determines your socioeconomic outcomes, and where everyone has what they need to thrive no matter where they live. These two go hand in hand because we know often it is your socioeconomic status that determines where you can live or how you live where you live. So those two are almost always talked about together. Secondly, as a process, those most impacted by structural racial inequity are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of the institutional policies and practices that impact their lives, right? So in the process, it means we're not making decisions for people or making policies for them, about them, without them. I've seen that quite a bit in the last few months, folks saying, you can't talk about that without talking to us. Don't make a decision about how Black and Brown folks should live without including Black and Brown folks. We are no longer standing for that. And so that's our definition of racial justice. So now that we've talked about equity, social justice, and racial justice, I just want to show you the position statement. I'm going to take us there again, just like the one on DAP. I want to show you what it looks like. And unfortunately, we won't have the time tonight to go through the whole thing, but I do want to call out certain areas of this for you. So here, right when you come here, it tells you what we mean by advancing equity. All children have the right to equitable learning opportunities that help them achieve their full potential as engaged learners and valued members of society. Remember, we said that with DAP, it's here again. Because remember, we said the advancing equity and DAP are part of these 5 foundational pieces of NAEYC. So I don't want us to forget that this is connected to DAP. When you look on the right side, it has recommendations for how do we do this? Now, when this was being drafted, a lot of thought went into, this is big, heavy work to do. How are we going to get it done? And it was recognized early on. It means that each of us has a part to play in this, and that we have to see ourselves on that continuum, right? Of how am I contributing to making this come to life? That we can't just have a statement and say, oh yeah, we believe that about equity. How do we make this come alive? How does this show up in the way that we behave? How does it show up in the way that we talk? How does it behave if you're like me, in the products and services that you're creating for early childhood professionals to use in the field? So it's at every depth, we should be thinking about how are we taking action to make equity not just another trendy passing phase, but to actually become core to how we do our work. So when you look at the recommendations for early childhood educators, it starts with the community. I mean, that's pivotal, right? When children come to be with us, they need community. And we've known for a very long time, community is essential because for them, learning happens in the context of relationships. I don't know how you get to community without relationships. So it's about how we establish relationships that then help us create community. And so as we're designing community with children, here are some things that we should be considering. And look at how we talk about relationships. Look at where it starts, right? Acknowledging there's value and dignity to each child and family, that we recognize them from a strengths-based perspective, that we really are talking about including all children in these community, and then we are establishing relationships. And then you continue to go down, how to involve their families, how do we promote their agency and scaffold their learning. So you see how this, even though we're in the equity equity statement is also about developmentally appropriate practice, right? These are the same things that we're trying to get to when we talk about using DAP. It really is about creating environments in where children's development is supported and they're helped to become thriving learners. They're not coming here just to pass the time, but to be active in their learning and owners of their learning and all those things we know about child development. Here it talks about reciprocal relationships with families, really challenging us to go deeper than just having family participation, right? This is about the relationship, the back and forth with families. So there's a section on that, assessment and advocacy. So I just wanted you to see that. And when you have time, I know Eric sent out the links, but to really come in here. And if you want to pick a place to start here. If you work with children in classrooms, if you don't, as many of you on the call have expressed, you're out of there. There are recommendations for you too. As an administrator, what should you be considering? And so this really gives you that one more level up out of the classroom look, right? About how do I care about staff? How do I react to the practices that I put in place with my staff and what I'm encouraging them to do in the classroom? Because I think this is a really important topic to talk about. And if you've not heard of critical race theory before, I'd love to be able to give that to you tonight to at least start to think about what it means so you can do more exploration about understanding critical race theory. Now, critical race theory, if you want to define that really simply, is the lens through which, I'm saying the lens through which we must look through when considering what is appropriate and what is equitable for children. Now, Ihioma Iruka, who was at High Scope and is now at the Frank Porter Graham Center, she's been on a whirlwind talk circuit all in the last year, really raising the issue of people incorporating critical race theory to the ways that they're viewing the work of early childhood, challenging us to disrupt the status quo. And I pulled this quote from a document that she, along with several other researchers, put together, because I thought this is really, I could teach you nothing else tonight, share with you tonight, it would be about critical race theory. And critical race theory says racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of the American society, that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture, and that power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, marginalizing people of color and others due to sex, class, national origin, and sexual orientation. Now, this may rub folks the wrong way that this is said so blatantly, but unless you can acknowledge that by design, our system works the way that it works, then very little gives you encouragement to disrupt that, right? Because if you don't think the system is broken, you just respond to the symptoms, the deeper problem, which is that this is systemic. And so when I think about how we will advance equity, it's going to take each of us doing some things, right? That starts in self-reflection. And I hope that you got that out of this session. That's really what I was wanting you to do, is to do some reflection about your own feelings, your own knowledge about this, using the resources to either enhance what you already know, to learn some new things, to do things differently. Because in that self-reflection, you have to be able to acknowledge what your own biases are, what your life experiences have been that shaped who you are right now, and the kind of early childhood professional that you are and want to be. And that while you're doing self-reflection, you also have a willingness to respectfully listen to others, and that's without interruption or defensiveness. I think the way you all reported out about your breakout groups was great, because it sounded like you made space for people to express themselves, and you were considerate about how folks in the classroom might be expressing themselves. And lastly, having a commitment to continuous learning to improve practice. I mean, your presence here tonight is evident of that. And that really what I encourage you to do is not to become stuck in the state of reflection, right? To think about all the things that haven't worked or all the work to be done, but really to start to move to action, to say, what can I do differently tomorrow to make a difference? There were some concepts we talked about tonight that I just wanted to leave here, because when Eric shares out the slides, if anyone wants them, you could pull this up and just really have a glance at what are some of the things that we talked about. Even though they were briefly tonight, I think they're still so important. Understanding commonality and context was critical. I think we've always understood individuality, but these other two add to that. Racial justice, social justice, equity, and then critical race theory. And lastly, one of my favorites, John Lewis, who passed away last year, right? He said, never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. I think his encouragement really is that there are times where this is not going to make people happy. When you have to stand up and be a voice that says, this is not right. This is not right for me, or it's not right for children. It's not right for these families. And sometimes that might get you in a little bit of trouble, but it's worth it if that's done so that we can have a more just and fair society. And when I think about all the things we talked about tonight, I think about how much is put on the early childhood professional that's with children. I think when people ask, oh, why should we pay early childhood educators more? This is like one reason. I could give you many, but look at what we're asking you all to do. We're asking you to change the very fabric of our society. Who else will do this? We do this in partnership with families, but you bear the responsibility, because it really is a responsibility, right? And also you're carrying the heaviest weight, which is really changing how we see one another in the world. And that's through influencing children as they develop to really be empathetic to one another, to consider that each of us has value, and to celebrate that. So I really appreciate that you all were here this evening and willing to listen and to share and to have a dialogue. And Eric, like I said, if anyone wants to have the slides, please feel free to share that with the group.
Great, thank you so much, Nicole. Can we just celebrate and honor Nicole's hard work putting this the session together for us, and just thank you for leading us through this important opportunity to reflect and start to disrupt the system and create a new early childhood system that's much more equitable and deserving of our children and families. So thank you so much to Nicole. I want to kind of bring us to a wrap. I hope your experience with this session really helped you to not only see how the developmentally appropriate practice position statement is structured and some of the ways in which you could use it in your context with children, with families, with educators, with early childhood students, but really one of the most important things that I think we learned from Nicole tonight was the reasoning behind why the developmentally appropriate practice statement was revised, and how much the people revising it and our field who helped inform this new document really thought critically about racial and social justice and about equity in order to create not an early childhood that used to exist, but an early childhood that could be. We can't go back to the early childhood system that we had before the pandemic. That system was inequitable, and it made sure that certain children and certain families got a quality education, and it made sure other children, typically children Black, Brown, and Indigenous, did not have as much access to quality early education. That's not fair, that's not socially just, and we are the people who can make a change and make a difference to not only break down those systems, but together with those who are most marginalized, create new systems that are equitable and fair and just for children, families, and educators. So our inspiration for you to think about tonight and as you move on into your work is to really study the document at naeyc.org/DAP. Study the DAP document, really think about, what do children deserve? Do they deserve to have joyous learning? Do educators deserve to have investments to pay them a worthy wage for the complex work that they do? Do communities deserve to make decisions about what they think is appropriate for their children and families that are being served? And then think about how you might be able to use what you've learned tonight to be able to advance equity in the individual actions that you can take as an early childhood professional. We would like to let you know that these slides, as well as some other resources that have been curated by Nicole, are available at azaeyc.org/DAP/webinar. Please stay connected with us. We are working very diligently to break down those oppressive systems and create new equitable early childhood systems here in our state and beyond. So please connect with AzAEYC and SAZAEYC. We're happy to keep you updated on some other sessions where you can reflect and continue to move your own thinking and your own work forward. And then finally, this experience is very much one that we hope to offer in the future, opportunities where people can really come together and acknowledge that systems of racism and oppression exist, and start to reflect on and think about how individually many of us can use our privilege in our own institutions and in our own context to be able to make a difference at the individual local level, and then start to grow to break down those bigger systems of oppression. So it is a professional development experience. We invite you to participate in a 5-minute survey. We just ask you to tell us a little bit about your experience. If you have any feedback for Nicole as the presenter, or for us as organizations sponsoring this event. If you would like to be marked as attended in the Arizona Early Childhood Workforce Registry, you can put your registry ID in the survey response. It should only take about 5 minutes to complete the survey. And then once you're completed with the survey, automatically it'll pop up a certificate of professional development for you. You just download it and that's yours to go. And then it'll show up in your PD education report if you give us your registry ID. So please go to bit.ly/114DAP. It'll take you right to the survey. Thank you again for joining us at tonight's session. Can we give one more round of applause to Nicole for helping guide us through this work?
Thank
we wish you well, and thank you, Nicole. We wish you well, and we'll hope to see you again at a future professional development.